Welcome to this week's Nurture the Soul. I'm Reverend Tracy Potter, and I serve as your Minister for Children's and Youth Engagement, as well as the Director of our Love of Children program. My co-host Tyler will introduce themselves in just a few moments. Together, Tyler and I serve at the national setting of the United Church of Christ, and we are part of the Faith Info team, which is your faith, education, innovation, and formation team. Nurture the Soul is a weekly webinar to share practical, educational, and innovative resources to engage with the critical topics of our time for our local churches and faith practitioners. From cultural and community organizing to congregational leadership, from worship and theology to resourcing small and rural congregations, from ministry with children and youth to a wide array of justice issues. We feature guest artists, authors, and key leaders to focus on care and education for the people of God. Nurture the Soul stays current to how the gospel is alive in our time today. We hope that this is a space for connection, community, and nurture. For together we can bring our church, our community, and the world towards the world which God imagines for all of us. We hope that you will join us every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Nurture the Soul. And from time to time, you can find special offerings, which are listed on ucc.org/events, or you can find it on any of our social media platforms. Friends, if this conversation moves you, if what's offered here helps you enhance your ministry and soul, please consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your prayerful and financial support helps programs like this in the essential work of the United Church of Christ. Thank you for supporting us and for being with us today. For the next 3 weeks, we will be gathering around the theme of love of children and youth. We know that the landscape of children's and youth ministry has been changing for the last decade, and these changes were only accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic years ago. As a result, many of us are wondering how to effectively provide services and ministry to and with young people. This webinar series is an opportunity to learn more about today's youth culture, how we can support them in their faith formation and leadership development, as well as gain some practical skills to equip our leaders who walk alongside of them. I now want to turn it over to my co-host Tyler to introduce themselves and our guests today.
Thank you, Tracy. And thank you all for joining us. My name is Tyler Ung, and I serve as the Assistant Program Director for the Love of Children. In 2023, the United Church of Christ was awarded a $1.25 million grant from the Lilly Endowment under their Nurturing Children Through Worship and Prayer initiative. With these funds, the national setting of the United Church of Christ began the Love of Children project, wherein we are developing ways for churches across the diversity of UCC settings to do ministry with children in innovative and engaging ways so that our youngest members can flourish. And one part of that project is this 3-part series of Nurture the Soul, focusing in on children's ministry and ministry with young people. Today, for our first episode in the series, we are delighted to welcome the Reverend Terrence L. Mayo. Reverend Mayo is a Black queer feminist, practical theologian, educator, and social impact strategist that strives to co-create change through contextual theological education, community-based change strategies, and racial equity. He serves as the Director of Community Ministry for the Center for Youth Ministry Training. And at that center, he leads the organization's work around equipping individuals and faith communities to support children, youth, and families outside traditional parish ministry settings. As a speaker, Reverend Mayo has shared his expertise on various topics, including Black theology with LGBTQIA+ youth, diversity, equity, and inclusion, education, community partnerships, public theology and social change, and trauma-informed strategies. He serves as on the national boards for Progressive Youth Ministry and the Howard University School of Divinity Alumni Association. He holds degrees in business administration, secondary education, and religion, and I am so grateful that you are joining us today. Thank you for joining and for sharing your wisdom, Terrence. Thank you so much. And we have some questions for you. The first is I'll often hear from some people that children's and youth ministry is just really hard because our young people only care about screens or social media and their weekend sports. So my first question to you is, what would you say in response to those people?
Thank you so much, Tyler, for that amazing question to like ground us in the space together. And I also want to take an opportunity to thank you and Tracy for the invitation. I'm so excited to be here with you virtually and with my colleagues in the United Church of Christ. So thank you again for the opportunity to share with you today. Um, yeah, I'll dig right in, right? I think I appreciate the question. I also, can affirm our youth workers, youth ministers, youth pastors that, the work is definitely challenging, right? And so I definitely first and foremost want to start with affirming people like the work is really challenging. It's also really complex as we think about, the lived realities of children and youth today, with so many things going on in our local communities, in our nation and across the world. So I definitely affirm that, it's important to remember that the work it's many times really hard. It's also really complex when we think about the very real barriers that youth and children are facing and those that support them. But I also think like there's some real opportunities that if we kind of lean into um, the thinking and the imaginations of young people, it can allow us to really rethink how we do ministry. Um, One of the things like I've noticed is that we as adults tend to relate to youth right through our own bias kind of lenses and our views based upon our own lived realities, which are important, but many times they don't cross over to what youth and children are facing today. And so, because of that, many adults kind of look at children and youth through this kind of deficit mindset and this deficit lens, and then start to use really like deficit language when they're working with or in the proximity of children. And so I think it really is important that we really identify, name the biases that we might have around children and youth, and think of ways like how do we confront those biases so we can really see children and youth as full human beings, and not as deficit based adults, right? Um, because when we really see children as whole human beings, as valued members of our communities, and of people who are divinely brought to us from God, we really see that there's some opportunities to really value them, to create safe space for them, and also to help us, right, reimagine what we think ministry should be and more lean into what it could be. And so children and youth really invite us into wonderment, into curiosity, and into joy in a world that is sometimes so very harsh and hard. Um, and so I really think the children and youth really allow us to see a different world that's possible if we really think of them as fully human, and allow them to kind of reshape what we think ministry should look like. Lastly, I would say also like there's so much evidence out there that show us like when children and youth really feel safe and are valued and are seen, they also really provide opportunities for us to also tend to the youth and children inside of all of us, right? And many times that's also to bring back the spirit of hope and joy and wonderment. And so while the work is complex and there are definitely some barriers, which I'm sure we'll talk about in our discussion a little bit more, there's really some opportunities to reimagine what ministry can be and should be in this new and diverse world we're living in.
Terrence, you talked about part of our challenge is seeing children as whole beings. And with that, that means that we have to acknowledge that the last 4 or 5 years has been really difficult. As adults, we've had challenges with the way things have been happening. But as we think about our children who are now entering that period of youth, what kind of long lasting impact are you seeing because of the COVID-19 pandemic and just the state of the world that we're in today?
Mm. Thank you for that question, Tracy. Yeah, it's been one part interesting, one part disheartening to kind of see how like the public language around COVID-19 has really not allowed us to live into the reality, right, that COVID-19 is still real, right? Many people in our communities are still dealing with um, long-term COVID-19 effects to our bodies. We're still, in many times, not dealing with the real realities of grief, of having to lose friends, family members, colleagues. Some of our youth also lost teachers, right? And youth workers and former ministers. We're also dealing with some of the consequences around even the lack of developmental opportunities and celebrations that youth should have had, right, if we had not had COVID-19. And so I always remind people that we're still, still feeling the repercussions of that, and some of the consequences of how the pandemic might not have been handled properly, and how that's directly affecting young people. And so some of the things that we're still seeing and still understanding from a research side and also from a practitioner side is young people were really, really affected by COVID-19 and still are affected, right? There were losses and gains in education. There were a loss again of having some of those critical periods of advancement programs that should have happened in school, a lack of the ability to share with friends and family members. Um, and so some of the things we're seeing from our youth and young people are that COVID-19 really, there were large breadths of substantial shifts in young people's mental health, and also previous social economic disadvantages were actually grew substantially larger. So I always say to people, COVID-19 really, in many ways, exasperated differences within what people had proximity to, whether it be healthcare, whether that be fully funded educational access, whether that be technology. And so, because of that, one of the things we're seeing, right, is that many of our young people have experienced increase in mental health challenges, and particularly groups that already had pre-existing vulnerabilities. It was exasperated. So it included like some youth who that come from lower economic households, young people who were facing already medical healthcare challenges. And also, the research says that girls specifically have really had and are dealing with some really specific mental health challenges coming about. Like I said before, one of the things that we notice that existing social, economic, and racial inequalities really were exasperated, right, because of COVID-19. And what we're seeing that even as we have moved to the other side of kind of the pandemic, those shifts and gaps aren't shrinking. They're actually growing larger. right? And so that's creating like some challenging situations as youth workers, as educators, as faith leaders are really thinking it through like, how do we really support our young people when they're really facing some not only mental health issues and challenges, but also challenges in education, where during COVID, many educators left the classroom, and they're not coming back, right? And so what we're kind of seeing around the country now, that many school districts are seeing a total movement away from educators. So lots of educators leaving the school system, also lots of school support personnel leaving the school system as well. And so parents are really asking the tough questions around where do they find support and where do they find help? And I think so there's some opportunities for us to also support youth, but also really think about like how do we support parents and caregivers, because many times they're left to kind of fend for themselves as well. And so I think some of the questions we need to continuously ask is what is the role of the church and supporting not only youth but also families as they are desperately in need of more resources, more support to really make sure that our young people can thrive.
Ooh. Wow, there's a lot there, Terrence. Before actually moving on to the next question, I was just a little curious if you had some more to say. Um, I'm going to tie together a few threads. You're asking the questions about what is needed from our church communities and our congregants, our church members. What help can we give? You're naming that gaps and problems that existed before the pandemic really widened through the midst of the pandemic. And before we were talking about our biases towards young people, sometimes thinking of them as obsessed with their screens, sometimes thinking of them as maybe not yet full people. And so, to bring all that together, what are some of the ways that we, as congregants and church members, uh, can push against our biases, recognizing that children's experience of the world, especially younger children, was mediated through screens. Like that's how they had to exist in the world through the pandemic. So on the one hand, how can we fight against our own biases? And on the other hand, how can we invite children into the world maybe more fully, knowing that that's something they're going to need some help with because that was a big part of their development?
Yes, love that question. So good. I would say, first and foremost, I think one, it's important that kind of we remember to take time out to play ourselves, and how play is an invitation for us not only to remember the child within us, but also play is a theological actual mechanism, right? From that reminds us of the importance of the divine in our lives. And so I always remind people, like, I always ask the question, was like, when was the last time you actually played? And people and adults are like, what do you mean? That's not for me. I'm an adult. I'm like, actually play is for us all, right? And so even in that invitation, it reminds people like, oh, like it's literally something that not only social emotionally helps to regulate our experiences, it is a opportunity of theological reflection, but it also is really an embodied practice. And what do kids do the best? They really teach us how to do embodied practices. And so I always remind people like, take some time to play. Um, on on TikTok a couple of months ago, there was a whole thing about Black men frolicking. And I was just like, yes. And just seeing images and videos of Black men frolicking, it literally did something in the psyche, right, of those that were walking the TikTok videos. And they were like, oh, wow, like I can frolic. I can have joy, I can play, right? And so I always tell people like, take some time to play. Um, Even if you don't have children, right? Find those opportunities to connect back with the land, connect back with yourself, your bodies, and just to play. So I always like invite people to that. I also to think to your question, like as you kind of motioned us to remember, like technology really was the only access point that you've had during COVID, right? And so part of our work or my invitation to adults is to go where youth are, right? And so many times I find adults like to say, oh, I have to take youth from the thing that they're engaged in. I'm like, well, how might we kind of reimagine that, right? How might we actually go where youth are? Because not only, was that a tool during COVID for them, for youth to find connection, for them to do relationship building, for them also to find their voice, right, and share their experiences. Um, that mode of sharing and community is not going to change, right? These are young people who are not only digitally fluent, they're digitally native. And so we need to change our positionality. And so I invite us, adults to think about, how do we even increase our own digital literacy? So, one, we can actually spend some time on social media with our youth. One, to engage with the stories that they're hearing, that they're seeing, and then invite them into a conversation afterwards about what they experienced, how they experienced it, and ask some questions about, you know, what did that feel like in your body? Did you think that what they shared was okay? Do you have questions about what they're sharing? Because one thing we see in some of the Pew research that came out earlier this year was um, there is not only in young people but even in millennials as well is one of the reasons why there's a disconnect between youth, young adults, and the church is they believe that the church is actually not speaking about social things that are happening in our world. And so actually engaging with youth in what they're seeing, what they're hearing on social media is an invitation to also have conversations around social justice issues, and to help them also make sense of the world that they're experiencing. And so my kind of shift in it is yes, that's where young people are. Give them the skills to actually understand how to be in social media in a healthy way, create healthy, clear boundaries for them, but also engage in that as an opportunity of deep relationship building. And that will also go a long way to building trust with them and to help them make sense of the world that they're living in, social issues that are happening, and also it's a great way to start possibly having conversations around social issues, social media, and mental health.
Wow, that was wonderful and rich. I have a ton of other questions that I want to ask you, but I won't because we have a schedule to attend to. But I would encourage anyone who's watching, please, I'm sure that you are also inspired by the things that Terrence is saying. Please put your questions in the chat. We'll have some time at the end of this to talk through some of the questions that you may have. For now, though, you've mentioned that we need to go and meet our young people where they are. That is an excellent reminder, something that we always have to do. And there are always places that we forget to go. In your opinion, are there any groups among young people who you feel are either forgotten or most vulnerable in today's children and youth ministry?
Hmm. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. All the babies. Yeah, I laugh in saying that, but I really mean that all of our children, our youth are really facing some um, really harsh circumstances and dealing with some, real significant things that they're trying to make sense of. And I also think about some specific groups, our LGBTQIA youth and our Black and Brown youth, and the very specific ways um, policies, politics, and laws are directly affecting them, their education, their livelihood, their ability to live, and also directly affecting their bodies and healthcare, right? What we know is the majority of the book bans that are happening across the country, they're directly affecting the stories that are told or stories that they're trying to hide around Black and Brown youth and LGBTQ youth, right? We also know about these quote unquote anti-CRT laws, right? They are specifically what they're fighting to do is to actually remove the real stories about America, right? And so they're fighting to create to remove the stories of Black and Brown communities from our history books, you know, remove those books, right, from our English studies. And so these laws are directly trying to take out the truth of who we are as a country and how we have disenfranchised, harmed, marginalized Black and Brown communities and LGBTQ communities. Um, Similarly, the anti-trans laws that are also popping up around the country. I always remind people that many times we think about these things that are happening only in the South, but actually that's not true, right? There are large pockets of this happening in the Midwest and even in the North, right? And so these anti-trans laws also are directly affecting our young LGBTQ youth. Um, and I would definitely say this movement around the privatization of K-12 education um, is also directly affecting these same communities, right? And so you see the proliferation of school vouchers, you see the proliferation of um, charter schools, and how that is directly affecting Black and Brown communities and LGBTQ youth. Um, and I definitely would be remiss and reminding the church, right, overall that this should not be things that actually gives way to a loss of hope, right? But it should reignite a kind of righteous rage within us that it is time that the church, right, really not only speak up but act up, right? Because we even think about how some of these laws are directly affecting some of our families that are the most sensitive to food insecurity, right? If you look at, just this week, right? The farm bill is being contested, right, in Congress. And the farm bill, for those that don't know, happens about every 4 years, where it has to be reauthorized, by Congress. And the Farm Bill is actually one piece of legislation that actually drastically improves the lives of families that are most affected by food insecurity. And so, as that's going through reauthorization, we already see political leaders that are trying to strip the bill of literally the thing that these families need the most, which is food. Um, we also see this happening outside of the Farm Bill, where, just a couple of months ago, 14 GOP-led states turned down federal money for low-income kids and families to have food in the summer. That's 14 states. So now over 10 million kids might not have the money, the nutrition, the food that they need in the summertime. I'll repeat that number again. 10 million kids. And so it's so important that one, we acknowledge that we can't do everything as an individual, but as collective houses of worship, as collective communities within communities, that we can take up some of these fights because our children and our families' lives are on the line. And so, it these are, and when you look at, and last thing, I'm gonna finish here because I started to get passionate about this, if you can't tell. When we look at some of the people that are creating these laws and literally shopping them from state to state, it's actually a really small group, right? That's the fascinating part. It's actually a really small group. So there is complete opportunity for us to turn the tide on these laws, to really make sure all of our youth, our children, our babies have what they need to really flourish.
That leads me to ask this question. You've already said that young people need us older people, us adults, to not only enter into spaces of play, and to meet them where they are, but what else is it that you think young people need in order to thrive? And I don't mean just exist, because we've all just existed the last couple of years, but to really move to that next level of living and thrive. What do young people need, and what's the church's role in that?
I am gonna answer this question. Absolutely. I'll also say, Tracy and Tyler, if you don't invite me back, I understand. I completely understand. But I believe in speaking truth to power. Um, so one, we really need the church to understand that you can't relegate children to the side. And so we really have to reimagine how we do ministry, right, with children and youth at the center in our decision making, in our theological praxis, right, in our liturgical offerings, really to make sure youth feel seen, they feel valued, and also they feel safe. Because what the research shows us, right, when children feel safe and valued and seen, they flourish. But this is not just something, and I'm going to speak directly into the camera. Uh, this also is an invitation for the whole church, not just youth minister, youth pastors, but the whole church to be involved in the flourishing of our young people. Because it takes, right, a web of connections, of deep relationships, of deep trust for young people to really see themselves as integral parts of the community. So the ask is, right, for us to shift from this lens of, oh, the youth pastor, youth minister will do this work, and we'll have maybe a volunteer or a couple volunteers, and they'll be good to go. We really need to shift this into, like, no, this has to be the central work of the entire church, right? Like I said before, the research shows us, so you have play, which is important. You also have to have belief, right? So belief that children are worthy, children should be valued, that children are an integral part and should be a part of our ministries. Also, in a belief that children have something to offer. Hello, hello, somebody. Right? And it's really a belief that children have something to really offer us in the workings of ministry, in the life of the church. And so inviting us to rethink even how we position, right, our churches. And then lastly, it's also an invitation to action, right? And to not, to one, name where we need to make change and then actually make the change, right? Within our churches, within our schools, because one of the things we know as we think about actually crafting a web of support, right? We need multiple healthy adult relationships to help students thrive. And so that's why it can't be just a youth minister, right? We need teachers, we need school counselors, we need medical providers, we need church leaders. Young people need a web of safe, healthy adult relationships really to thrive. And lastly, they need that not their basic needs being met, right? And so if we have families in our church, in our communities that are housing insecure or that are food insecure or that might not have internet access, we need to make sure those needs are being met to help really to move past just the basic physical, psychological, social emotional needs, and then to move us into flourishing.
Wow. First of all, amen. Full stop. Second, I'd like to maybe dive a little bit more concretely into some of those things. So you mentioned that one thing that churches need to do is they need to stop relegating young people to the sidelines. So my question for you is maybe what's one way that you see churches doing that, and how might we do something differently? It doesn't have to be the thing that all our churches have to do, but what's an alternative to that one thing that you wish that churches would just stop doing when it comes to ministry with young people?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, yeah. I think, one of the um, ways to kind of pivot is when we think about like the decision-making mechanisms within the church. I always invite people to think, and I ask the question, okay, where are young people's opportunity to weigh in on that? And they're like, wait, what do you mean? I'm like, yeah, you mentioned that the deacon board will meet, or you mentioned that the elders board will meet, or you mentioned that the church leadership team will meet. But when do you actually stop and ask the young people? And they're like, oh, yeah, we should do that. I'm like, yep, you should do that. And also not to do it haphazardly, but to have intentionality around it, right? And so, yes, asking young people for their opinion will not be using Robert's rules of order. It's not going to work like that. It is so it requires some intentionality. So one, I invite them like, okay, well, where are the young people meeting? First, meet them where they're meeting. So don't ask to like for them to meet potentially at a new space, but actually meet them where they're meeting, and then work with youth workers, youth ministers to integrate into an actual conversation. And so sometimes that also includes, right, thinking about how you physically represent yourself, right? Because what we know, kids will reflect what's given to them. And so if you come into the space holding a bunch of power in a three-piece suit, standing over them, right? To say, oh, I want your opinion. You have 20 minutes to give me your opinion, and then I'm moving on, right? We totally have to shift how we do that. And so that made me, having a more relaxed attire. That also maybe mean let's take out, right, the chairs, let's take out the desk or whatever's in that physical space, and let's actually put ourselves on the same level as kids and then have a conversation with them, right? And then think through with your youth workers, youth staff, ministers, some of the questions that you want to ask, and invite them to give you feedback before you ask the young people. And so that'll help them kind of think through how to ask some of the questions better.
One of the things that I hear often in the role that I sit in with the national setting, and I see it in the chat today, is that our youth aren't coming back. There are lots of stories of our church has closed or our youth group isn't meeting, and there's so much despair and hopelessness in our congregations, in the world, in the media, in all of these places, Terrence. What about our young people still brings you hope? Why do you get up and do this work day after day when you could be doing something else?
Oh, wow. Love that question. Um, yeah, young people, when they feel safety, they feel security, and they feel valued, they invite us to see the world as it could be. And that always inspires me. Many times as adults, we are conditioned, right, as we grow up to you have to stay in this box. You have to only think about the tangible reality of what the world currently is. And young people are like, but why? Why do we do this? Right? Why does it have to be that way? And on its surface, you know, especially as we're, busy adults, sometimes on the surface, you're just like, oh, that's so annoying. And it can be. I'm not going to lie, it can be. Absolutely can be. It's also, if we do some self-reflection, it's also, they have the ability to really remind us of why imagination is so important, right? Because through imagination, we then can remember that it doesn't have to be this way. And we do still have opportunities to change things. And we have opportunities to reimagine, right? All of this stuff. And so part of what young people remind us to do is to question, to reimagine, and to really lean into wonderment in the most important ways. Because what we need now more than anything, I would say, is joy, hope, and imagination to move us into a very different place. And so that's why I'm always excited to sit and just many times throw out a question, and more of the time just listen, and just be curious, and to think things through. And like you said as well, like part of what we're seeing young people kind of moving away from the church or moving away from some more traditional ways of you doing ministry, kind of like I said before, because the church is not speaking about the social realities of the world that we're living in. And young people not only have questions about themselves, about the world that they are experiencing, they also have really amazing questions about why do some people have and some people do not have? And why are these wars going on? And why are things the way they are? And I think some of the reasons why we are scared of those questions is because it actually would make us answer those questions for ourselves. And so they do invite us to put up a mirror to ourselves. And so sometimes that scares people.
Wow. Truly, truly good stuff. What comes to mind as I heard you talk, Terrence, was almost a tall bookshelf. And our spiritual resources are all sitting on this shelf. And maybe as we grow, there are things that we can reach up on the top shelves that our children can't. And we can tend to think of ourselves maybe as higher than them. Uh, but things like hope and imagination are down on that bottom shelf, and it hurts my back to reach down there, and
Mhm.
they're getting dusty. And we need our children to remind us of those gifts. Thank you for the gift of that image. The last question that we have for you before we open it up to some of the questions that are in the chat. And if you have other questions as you're listening to this conversation, please put them in there. We'd love to make sure that we at least talk about them a little bit. It's a pretty open question for you. Do you have any last comments or things that you think people ought to know as we reframe ministry with young people?
Mm, hmm So much, so much. Um, so yeah, so as we think about kind of like I said before about some of the things that we're currently seeing in our young people. One of the things that's really it's passionate to me, and also I think it's an ongoing important conversation, is around youth mental health, right? And youth social emotional development. As I said before, before COVID, there was already some kind of wide divides happening. And also, we saw some increasing mental health concerns happening. And then COVID-19 really exasperated that and took them to another level. So, I really invite everyone that I talk to think about and consider, you know, to think about and be serious about youth mental health and well-being, and what that looks like in different contexts. There's some amazing resources out there. I encourage people to even do youth mental health first aid training, because that's an important way to kind of proactively identify, understand, and respond to mental health challenges and all substance abuse challenges. And it also has a great way for those that may be on a peripheral of supporting youth, of ways they can get more engaged. I think also the need for us to really, really have deep, trusting relationships with young people and their families. So many times we think about supporting youth and children in this vacuum and not about the families that they're a part of. So, yes, we want to directly support youth and children. We also want to support their families, right? Because what we know is when a family is healthy and is whole and their needs are met, children and young people's needs are met as well. And so, how do we start to think about families as whole units to make sure needs are met? Lastly, I would say, really, I think for all adults, really to build our digital literacy skills is super, super important. There's still a lot, from what I've seen, a lot of fear around a lot of social media. There's also generative AI is coming on the board, and that will not be going anywhere soon, right? We see it in our schools. We're seeing it all over the place. And so it really behooves us as whether it be caretakers, educators, youth workers, faith leaders, to build our own digital literacy skills so we can also support our young people to have healthy relationships with social media, with the usage. But if we don't know, we can't really have conversations with them. So really to help build our digital literacy skills. And sometimes, I just go on TikTok just so because I love TikTok, and also there's very different conversations happening on TikTok and Snapchat that are not happening on older apps like Facebook and Instagram. But anyway, it's also a good place to go to hear from young people, to see their expressions, also to hear what's on their heart. Then lastly, last fasting thing I promise is, I think all leaders within churches need to really build their skills in intercultural intelligence and intercultural communication. They're different. They go together, but they're different, right? Because what we also know is our communities are intensely diversifying. And diversity is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful thing. But harm can occur if we are not aware of ourselves and the communities. And so we talked a little bit about bias earlier, right? And so our biases and our assumptions also can play a part in how we do ministry. And if we're not careful, we'll do harm. And as our country's demographics change even faster and more dramatically in the next 5 to 10 years, right? All faith leaders and community leaders, right, should be building their skills in intercultural intelligence and communications so we can really serve our communities, our families, and youth better.
As we prepare to wrap up in a few minutes and turn our attention to the chat, I did notice there are a few questions. So one question that I alluded to already was, what practical steps do you have for people who say, we don't have any youth in our church anymore? They're not coming back. So in addition to the meeting the young people where they are, in addition to the dreaming and reimagining ourselves, are there other things you would offer to anyone who is in that same position of not having youth coming back?
Hmm. Oh, yeah. So I think one the first things that comes to mind, if you're really seeking to know some of the things that's happening in your local community, which I hope all churches are, one of the great ways to kind of learn about that is to go to your community's PTSA meetings. You will be surprised at some of the conversations, the dialogue, the things that are being brought up. And typically, you can just look on the school's website, and many schools will have like a PTSA section to their website, or you can call the school to say, "Hey, I'd love to know more about when your PTSA are meeting and how to get connected." That's a great way of to growing some attention. One, to build community with the actual community, and two, to start to gain an understanding of what's happening in the lives of young people and families in your direct communities. I would say another way to kind of think about this is start to figure out where the youth are, right? Because that's also a great indicator of what they're seeing as safe spaces. And it could be, not saying this is, but it could be part of the reason why there are shifts in how or when children come to some faith spaces is they might not feel valued and they might not feel safe. And so finding out where youth are going is a great way to figure out where they feel safe. And then two, having conversations internally within the congregation to think about one, ask yourselves the questions, why do you want young people in the church? Because sometimes we haven't done that first level yet. We haven't done that self-reflection, right? Is it that you want young people in the church, that you're deeply committed to their development, their well-being, or do you want people in the church for other reasons, right? And so this is the difference between seeing youth as property versus seeing youth as people. And so doing that kind of internal work within the church is also so helpful.
There's another question that I again hear way too often. There's this older belief that children should be seen and not heard. So how do you help adults, families, whoever, who feel like children should sit next to their parents and just be quiet during worship
Mm-hmm.
simply because they had to growing up?
Right, right. I always invite people, uh, try to do an invitation. I'm like, do you want to recreate the possible traumatic experiences you had, or do you want to invite a new creation to happen? Um, try to do that work to kind of do a soft landing into having some further conversation, right? And so I remind people, there are several scriptures that talk about why the laugh of children, right, is something divine to God, right? The wonderment, the scripture talks about wonderment, talk about joy, talks about laughter, and it's there for a reason, right? And so I invite them to remember those scriptures and then to think about how do we create liturgical practices which invite that. From a child development specialist lens, I put on the different hat and I also remind people that our young people are literally not designed to do that. It literally goes against their very nature. And so, if we're thinking about using trauma-informed strategies or using children-first strategies and liturgy, right, part of it is an invitation to think through like what feels good to children's bodies and their psyche, and why that's important to think through our liturgical offerings. And maybe you might say, we will invite youth to be in part of this part of the service, right? As you kind of potentially move to more of a child-centered kind of liturgy, right? You may think about inviting them in for certain portions or inviting them out for certain portions, but to rethink our liturgical practices where our children can be at the forefront of that thought process, I think is super, super important to also humanize us as adults as well. Because some of it, right, some of it is our own needs to police our own bodies that we then enforce on children. And so might the invitation to free the bodies of children also free ourselves? Ooh, that'll preach right there. Come on, Holy Ghost. Come on.
Um, there's one more question I want to ask before we move to our closing and benediction, if that's okay, Terrence.
Absolutely.
So the question is, as we think about some of our ethnic identifying congregations who are historically disenfranchised and marginalized from the wider United Church of Christ, and I would say even some of our other denominations as well. How do you see us being able to engage with our youth who are very much different than our older adults? How can we effectively do intergenerational ministry while honoring the past and the future?
Hmm. Yeah, at first I will admit, it's hard work, right? One of the things as human beings, especially as we become adults, the thing that we know the most becomes the easiest to do. And so we just keep doing it, right? And so kind of doing that work of one, interrogating the things that we do is super important. It's also, it takes time. Now, that is not kind of a scapegoat to never do the work. That's not what I'm saying. But it is an invitation to think through, like, how do we do it in a way that one has intentionality, two, that identifies and named harm that might have occurred, and repair the harm. And then three, I would say also, how do we then use decolonize ways to create anew. And so some quick examples of that is sometimes you may need to do a truth and reconciliation process with your congregation because there might have literally been instances where communities of color were harmed in your church or your local body, right? And so you may need to name the harm, ask for forgiveness for the harm and repair what's happened, right? Two, that also looks like, having really truthful, honest conversations that invite different perspectives to truthfully occur. I give this quick example that many times we're quick to invite people in, but we're actually not, we don't want the truth. Because then once we hear the truth, it shuts us down. So I always invite people to think through, like, as we're doing this walk, to create more welcoming, inclusive spaces where radical candor can happen. Because one thing that happens when you invite young people in, they're going to tell you the truth. So you need to also brace yourself that it may not be the way that you want to receive it. And that's okay, but still open yourself up to listen. Um, and then two, think through, like, after you've heard the truth, then what are you going to do about that to create the change, both on an individual basis, because it has to start from an individual basis, and then for the actual community.
Wow. Reverend Terrence, thank you. Thank you so much for all of the wisdom that you've offered here. I know that my mind is certainly churning with possibilities and questions. Friends, if you're joining us and you have further questions, please know that you are always welcome to reach out to us. I believe our contact information is in the chat, and it will also be in the follow-up email to this. We would love to continue this conversation. Thank you for joining us for this three-part Love of Children series of Nurture the Soul, where we will be asking questions and seeking answers about ministry with children. We look forward to being with you all again next week, as we'll be joined by Danielle Hickman, who's the Minister for Volunteer Engagement with Global Hope Team at the National Setting of the United Church of Christ. A sustainable children's ministry needs robust help from volunteers, and we'll gather next week to learn more about how to find, recruit, and care for those volunteers. And now, I would like to invite Reverend Terrence to send us from this beautiful and enriching moment with a benediction.
Thanks so much, Tyler and Tracy, for the opportunity to share with you all. I definitely consider it an honor. It's been wonderful to be in this virtual community with you all. And I definitely, if you want to learn more about the work we're doing at the Center for Youth Ministry Training, about what we have to offer, we'll definitely share the links with you if you like more information. And I definitely also want to share the upcoming fall conference for progressive youth ministry will be happening later this year. So if you're having questions around power, multiculturalism, or how to support youth workers, I definitely will share a link with you about that as well. So I definitely encourage you to come and share with us. And lastly, before I go into the closing prayer, I definitely want to lift up this prayer. It's called the New Zealand Anglican Lord's Prayer, which I absolutely love, and really want to dedicate it to children and youth workers in Palestine, Congo, Haiti, Sudan, and all of the other countries around the world who are really facing war due to colonization and greed. But hear ye these words of prayer as we begin to leave this space together. And I invite you to also feel your breath in this moment, because God is in our breath. Eternal Spirit, Earth Maker, Pain Bearer, Life Giver, Source of all that is and that shall be, Father and Mother of us all, loving God, in whom is heaven. The hallowing of your name echo through the universe. The way of your justice we follow by the peoples of the world. Your heavenly will be done by all created beings. Your commonwealth of peace and freedom sustain our hope and come on earth. With the bread we need for today, feed us. And the hurts we absorb from others, forgive us. In times of temptation and test, strengthen us. From trials too great to endure, spare us. from the grip of all that is evil. Free us today. For you reign in the glory of the power that is love, now and forever. Amen, amen, and ashe. May you go with peace.
Siblings in Christ, if you were moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.